Well, there are a lot of teams vying for that final number 1 seed, but does anybody want to be the number 1 overall seed?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a 5 times per week national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your co-hosts. I'm Andy Patton. He's Isaac Shade, and we are in the greatest month of the year. It's March. Isaac, I am so excited to be continuing to talk about college basketball. It was another fantastic weekend of hoops. Once again, every time we have this conversation, we're trying to figure out how can we find how can we find only 30 minutes of stuff to talk about on the podcast. So many fantastic games. Want to start talking about the Crimson Tide, talking about Alabama, and really talking about the kind of competition for those 4 number 1 seeds. We've seen a lot of teams trying to get into that final spot. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. Big win for UCLA. Purdue escaped with the victory. Texas, really nice win over Kansas. Kind of those teams vying for that final 4th number 1 seed. But right now we have an issue where it doesn't seem like a lot of teams even want to be number 1 overall. Houston barely escapes from Memphis, a tricky conference game for them. Of course, Alabama loses at Texas A&M 67-61. And now we're kind of in a spot where it's hard to know who's going to be number 1 overall on Selection Sunday when the brass makes those decisions. Isaac, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny, Andy, how it chronologically unfolded across Saturday and Sunday, because we had Alabama losing first, like kind of Saturday afternoon-y. And then so I started tweeting out, I'm like, dude, Alabama doing this. If Kansas wins at Texas today, they're hands down overall number 1 for me, even if they don't win Big 12. But then they lost, and I was like, all right, well, I guess I'm back on Houston. But I started looking at resumes again, and I was like, man. And so I'm going to reserve my current thought of who is the actual overall number 1. But then Houston barely, as you said, eked out a win at Memphis. And I get it. It's on the road against a desperate Memphis team trying to secure their NCAA tournament hopes. But I want to go to the Alabama of it all. And here's why. Andy, we have gushed and raved, and I'll even say fawned over the Alabama Crimson Tide because they were absolutely crushing people throughout the SEC season.
They looked unbeatable.
Looked unbeatable. Andy, here's the thing. Since that Wednesday, like just shy of 2 weeks ago, when all this Brandon Miller news broke, Alabama is 3-1 since then, including that very night. But in those 4 games, they won at South Carolina that night in overtime, 78-76, 2-point win. They beat Arkansas by 3 at home. They beat Auburn by 5 at home. It took overtime. And then they lost at Texas A&M, as you said, over the weekend. So let me just give you some numbers separating these 2 halves of their SEC play. First 14 SEC games before this news came out, Alabama was 13-1. Average margin of victory, 23.2 points. And they had 11 double-digit wins and 0 overtime games, just crushing people like grapes. But in those 4 SEC games that I just rattled off since the news came out, average margin of victory is 3.3, 0 double-digit wins, and 2 OT games. This is not the same Alabama team anymore. I'm wondering if I can trust them now. Now, I know in terms of seeding and things like that, we got to take metrics and resume because we've essentially taken the eye test out of where do we seed teams. But in terms of choosing them in my brackets and how far I'm going to send them, I ain't in on them anymore as much as I personally was. And I would imagine others around the country are feeling the same. But the big question becomes, when we look at these 3 teams that we've had in the rotation for the number 1 overall seed, being Houston, Kansas, and Alabama, who wants that overall number 1? When I look at this, despite them being the team that lost of these 3 the worst this weekend, I think Kansas has the best resume of these 3 right now. And I have the Jayhawks, even after losing at Texas 75-59, as my number 1 overall team in the nation heading into championship week. Andy, am I wild? Am I crazy? Am I dumb?
Well, you're pissing off a lot of Houston fans. I'm gonna tell you that right now.
I'm sorry, Kelvin. I'm sorry, Kelvin.
Shout out Locked On Cougs host Parker Ainsworth. Maybe we tell him to skip this one. No, I understand 100%. I think you look at the overall resume that Kansas has, and you obviously the Big 12 schedule helps them tremendously, but they've picked up a ton of incredible victories this season. The loss to Texas, it's not a great loss. It's a 16-point loss. You don't love that. But Texas is really, really, really good. They're a very, very good team. And while I think Memphis is probably a better team than the masses might give them credit for, they are not as good of a team as Texas. I don't think that is a even remotely debatable conversation. And Houston obviously did win that game. Shout out Jamal Shed for hitting a game winner there. I'm desperately needed game winner for Houston. But for me, I'm probably still going to put Houston on the one line at this point, or on the number one overall seed. Obviously, they're going to be a one seed as well. But it does depend, and it kind of depends how the tournaments go, because the AAC tournament is going to be different. If Kansas wins the Big 12 tournament, they will have won the Big 12 tournament by playing some really, really legit elite opponents. The same can be said for Alabama if they win the SEC tournament. If Houston wins the AAC tournament, it's a bit more expected, which doesn't make it necessarily easier. It doesn't mean that, a loss is devastating for them, but if all three of these teams win, you have to factor in what those victories look like for Alabama, for Kansas, versus what they mean for Houston. Even to that matter, talking about some of the other teams we're going to talk about, same with Purdue, same with UCLA. Like if they win their conference tournaments, like I don't think that either of those two teams would jump over Houston. I don't think that that's fair necessarily, but winning those conference tournaments is a little bit different. So it kind of creates an interesting situation as we look at what those 4 number 1 seeds are going to look like, because right now it feels like a whole bunch of teams want to be 4th, but there aren't a whole lot of teams who want to be number 1. And then somebody's going to have to end up being in that spot.
And it's just, going back to Kansas, if they win the Big 12 tournament, as you just said, they will have 18 quad 1 victories, Andy. 18 quad 1 victories. That is just stupid. So let's switch the conversation to what you just said. We've looked at this number 1 overall. We think those 3 teams are probably locked into the top 3 1 seeds, barring maybe Houston losing in the AAC tournament and UCLA winning the Pac-12. I could see maybe at that point, but that's all speculation. Mm-hmm. As for the 4th number 1 seed, it seems right now like it's between UCLA, Texas, and Purdue. There could be somebody else that sneaks in. I can say that. Sure, why not? But it's going to be one of these 3 schools, right? Like they have the 3 best next resumes. Mm-hmm. Purdue's been right there most of the season. Yep. Texas has racked up all these great wins that you've talked about, including that double-digit win over Kansas on Saturday. And UCLA, Andy, just won the Pac-12 by 4 games. Where are you going if you had, let's say today was the end and we were seeding the field? Who's your 4th number 1 now?
I'm glad it's not today, and I don't have to make that decision quite yet. But I do
spill my drink, Andy. Don't make me laugh when I'm drinking.
I think I'd go with UCLA. I think I'd go with UCLA here, and I think it's close. Obviously, I think the difference between the 2nd or 3rd number 1 seed and the 2nd or 3rd number 2 seed, quite honestly, is very, very close. All those teams are kind of pretty equal right now. But UCLA, like you said, they won a major conference by 4 games. Yes, it's the Pac-12. Yes, the Pac-12 is pretty down. Outside of Arizona, they're pretty down. They're probably going to end up squeezing a 3rd team into the big dance. It's probably going to be USC, but that's it. And the fact that they were not guaranteed to get a 3rd seed into the NCAA tournament for the majority of the season tells you a lot about where the Pac-12 is from a basketball perspective. But it doesn't mean that UCLA's accomplishments should be taken down at all. UCLA has been incredible all season long. I mean, they've been truly, truly fantastic. Big victory over Arizona State. They got a win over Arizona, a 9-point win over Arizona on Saturday. That was a big win for them. The injury to Jalen Clark is the biggest kind of factor for me. Yeah. I don't know how much it'll factor into the decision makers in terms of where they get seated, but obviously it's going to have a significant impact on how far I'm willing to select them to go in March. If he's still hurt, if he's missing games, I mean, he's a huge part of what that team does. And if he's not out there on the floor for them, I'm much less likely to advance them very far in the tournament, but that doesn't take away from what their resume has been up to this point. Purdue, obviously fantastic resume as well. We saw them go through that significant dry spell a few weeks ago. They seem to have kind of pulled out of that a little bit. They won at Wisconsin. That's a big win. A desperate Wisconsin team, for them to pull a victory there is significant. I think it's kind of between those two. I have Texas slightly below, even after the win against Kansas. I think that we've just seen a little bit of inconsistency from them. The ability to shoot the basketball hasn't always been there. They've dropped some games that they, maybe shouldn't have dropped. The Big 12 is never easy in any capacity, but I have them just below where I have UCLA and Purdue. But again, I think that this is going to be a year where the 2 seeds are going to be really, really strong. Not necessarily stronger than the 1 seeds, but I think that it's going to be a competition.
And I think so much of that is to your point about like, glad we don't have to make those decisions today, because the whoever wins these conference tournaments could play it. Like if Texas rolls through the Big 12 and wins that thing, it's going to be hard to keep them out of that number 4 slot. But Andy, if I have it correct right now, you would put of 4, 5, 6, you would go UCLA, Purdue, Texas. Is that fair? I'm right with you. That's how I would slot this too. Obviously the Jalen Clark of it all, and especially how that might affect UCLA this week in the Pac-12 tournament, that could be a factor in it. But I'm going to go with you there. And it seems like the biggest difference that we have between us is right at number 1 overall, where I would have Kansas, you would have Houston, and then we both have Bama at 3. Is that where you're at?
Yep.
Okay. Love it, love it, love it. So that's where our top 6 stand. How about this, Andy? On Saturday, we get all 10 Big 12 teams playing every Saturday. I love that. There were 4 games that featured at least one AP ranked team. And in the Big 12 on Saturday, the 4 better AP ranked teams all lost. What on earth happens? How do we sort out the Big 12 and how they're going to perform in March? We're going to talk about that in just a second. But first, let me tell you about Built Bar. Hey, you looking for a delicious treat, but you don't want all the fat and calories? Then you got to try a Built Bar. If you're like me and you want to eat healthier without sacrificing the taste, then I've got the thing for you, and it's Built, because with Built, healthy is actually tasty. And why is it so good? Well, first off, they're covered in 100% real chocolate, and they come in these great flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and I'm not sure how Built does it, but honestly, they taste great while maintaining amazing macros. Just 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. And Andy, I need that right now because the Shade family is starting to try to get into swimsuit shape literally today. It's a terrible day to do it right before we get to March Madness, but whatever. I've got my wife sent me a challenge on my watch. It's a whole thing that we're starting today. And listen, now folks, you don't have to wait around for these bars to come from built.com, because you can run on down to Sam's Club or Walmart and get yourself a little tiny 4 count, or go big on the bulk at Sam's Club. So get you some Built Bars. You won't be disappointed. Built Bar, a proud sponsor of the Locked On Network. Okay, Andy, I want to skate through the results of what happened in the Big 12 of Saturday, but let me give you those just so everyone can hear it. And then I want to ask a question about just the state of the Big 12 and where these teams are at. So again, we had 4 games that featured at least one ranked team. We've already touched on Texas beating Kansas. So that was the one game between 2 ranked teams, but the lower ranked team beat the better ranked team in that one. Then we had Iowa State over Baylor 73-58. And this game was at Baylor in Waco. West Virginia getting a huge bubble win to, I think, solidify themselves into the tournament at home against Kansas State, 89-81. And then Oklahoma over TCU there in Norman. I don't think Oklahoma's in, but it's a tough, again, another loss for TCU, 74-60. And then in kind of an elimination game, I think Oklahoma State beats Texas Tech 71-68. I think the Cowboys are still on the outside looking in personally, but it remains to be seen. By the way, quickly, we learned on Sunday that Texas Tech's coach Mark Adams is going to be suspended for some length of time for some insensitive comments he made to a player. That's all we have on it at this point. We'll obviously talk about it more as that news unfolds. Texas Tech and their coaches and former coaches, not a great look this season so far, Andy Patton. So here's the big question about the Big 12. We saw what happened on Saturday. I think it's like It's like senioritis. You get to spring of your senior year, and these teams are just like, man, I'm done. I'm out. I'm so over this conference right now. Just get us to this tournament in Kansas City, and then sweet Jesus, baby Lord, can we get to the NCAA tournament? And so my question is this. Are these Big 12 teams going to leave conference play and go beat up on everyone as the conference records would suggest because they're the best conference in basketball? Or have they all just been beat up so much by this gauntlet that they're just mentally taxed and done and just want to go on summer vacation? Where do you think these, and I know I'm asking it at the big picture level, and it's not allowing for much individualization. So you'll have to drill down on that yourself. But give me an answer to that question.
Yeah, I think the Big 12 is going to perform fine in the NCAA tournament. I think they're going to do well. And I think that fear is understandable. Yep. And I think that there's a possibility. I mean, there's going to be lots and lots and lots and lots of Big 12 teams in the NCAA tournament. It's going to feel like dang near all of them because it's going to be dang near all of them that are playing in March. And they're all going to perform differently. Obviously, these 8 teams are not going to be the Elite 8 necessarily, but they're also not all going to lose in the first round.
Matchup dependent as it all those things. Yeah,
right. But I do think that for the most part, the Big 12 is going to be fine. I think that these teams have. Yes, they've beat up on each other pretty significantly. And yes, when you see a result like a hot Baylor team that's kind of on the precipice of being a 2 seed get beat by 15 points, that's a little startling. And when you see a team like Kansas, who quite honestly probably would have been the favorite to be the number 1 overall seed unanimously had they beat Texas.
Yeah,
instead, they get beat by 16. And I think when you see those results, you start to think, oh my goodness, what is going on? Like, are these, like you said, are these teams just packing it in? Are they beat up? Are they exhausted? And there's kind of this concept of cannibalism that we see conferences go through in the past. And usually what it is it's teams getting, they suffer a catastrophic loss to a not very good team in their conference. Stanford beating Arizona. It didn't completely derail Arizona's season, but that's the kind of game that we're talking about. The Big 12 doesn't really have those games because the worst teams in the Big 12, even if they beat the best team, it rarely destroys their resume all that much. So I think these Big 12 schools are going to be fine. There's a few that I'm worried about. I'll be honest. I'm worried about Baylor.
Really?
Baylor has their defense is bad, like not just like bad for a Big 12 school or bad for a top 10 school. Like it's just bad. Like they're not a good defensive team. They have very little rim protection. They have very little offense from their front court. They basically rely pretty exclusively on their 3 guards. And they're a well-coached team. I believe in Scott Drew. I'm not sure that the roster construction here is the kind of roster that's going to get them to a national championship like they had 2 years ago. They just don't have that kind of team. So I'm a little bit worried about them, but not as much because of them losing to Iowa State as much as like, I think that this is just a flaw on this team that we have seen crop up a handful of times this year, and somebody's going to exploit it in March. But then you look at somebody like Kansas State, like, on paper, you might look at them losing to West Virginia and think, "Oh, that's a really bad loss for them. Like, are the Wildcats in trouble?" I'm like, I'm not that worried about it. No. Bob Huggins is a good coach. West Virginia's a good team. You don't want to go on the road and get 90 hung on you. Like, that's never good. But I think Jerome Tang's a good coach, and I think that this team is probably going to learn from this in a way that I have a little bit more confidence they might be able to actually like carry some momentum if they have a strong performance in the Big 12 tournament and actually do some damage when we get into the tournament. So again, the situations are always a little bit different, but by and large, I don't think that the Big 12's the challenge of their conference schedule is going to negatively impact these teams when we get into the NCAA tournament.
And keep in mind with Baylor, Keontae George was back on Saturday. So we can't give that excuse of, they're down, they're super. No, he was playing. Now, what percent is he healthy? Great question. I obviously can't answer that, but he was healthy enough to play, and they still lost in that fashion. So to put numbers on it, Baylor's defense is 90th right now at KenPom defensive efficiency. The lowest next rank Big 12 defense is Texas Tech at 50. Texas Tech, isn't that weird? At 55th. And so, listen, Andy, I share those concerns gravely about Baylor. And if I can flip that offensive defensive conversation in a similar vein, the team outside of Baylor that concerns me most is Iowa State. They have tripped and stumbled over their own 2 feet down the stretch. We just said about how great Baylor's offense is versus their defense. Iowa State's the exact opposite. Their defense is KenPom 7th in defensive efficiency. Their offensive efficiency, Andy, any guesses where Iowa State is? I'm going to tell you it's worse than where Baylor's defense is ranked.
like 110th.
Just 101, dude.
Oh,
like they're outside the top 100 in offensive efficiency. Like that's just not
going to get it done.
Not to mention no Caleb Grill now. And like I know you've got Gabe Kalsher and a whole host of other guys, but man, I just worry about Iowa State stepping in. I know they picked up, I can't even remember who it was now, but got a good win midweek. I'm pulling it up in real time. Beat Baylor. That's who it was. Well, there we go. So Baylor, I guess has dropped those multiple games now, but man, Iowa State is the team I'm worried about in terms of like actual performance in March. Andy, right now, I know we still got the Big 12 tournament to go. Give me a number. End of the day, how many of the 10 Big 12 teams are dancing?
8. 8 is my guess.
Okay.
I think Tech's out. I think Oklahoma State is.
Those are the two
probably out. Yeah.
I think everybody else is in there. Oklahoma are the definites that are out.
Right. Like West Virginia's in, right?
Say it again.
West Virginia's in, right?
I would put West Virginia in, and then Oklahoma State's the big question mark. So it's 7, pending what Oklahoma State can do, could get to 8. Since you're saying 8, I'm going to go with 7 just so that I can be right and you can be wrong. And
I'll accept it.
And we'll move forward from there.
Well, Isaac, it is Monday, and on Mondays, we typically do our 6-pack. And as we have been doing the last couple of weeks, our 6-packs feature extra bubbles this week as we're going to talk about games that had significant impacts on the NCAA tournament bubble and the 5 teams that are officially going to go dancing that we know of as of this moment. All right, let's talk Big Ten because we just spent a lot of time talking about the Big 12. And one of the conversations that we kind of have had a lot about the Big 12 is how talented this conference is, how many teams we might put in the big dance, and also just like how much respect they're getting from the committee. I mean, we're talking about their 7th or 8th place teams potentially making the NCAA tournament. We just talked about that. And so for the Big Ten, we kind of see that conference get treated somewhat similarly in a lot of ways. Many times when looking at bracketology reports this year, whether it's from Joe Lenardi or from Lucas Harkins, former guest of the show, or really anybody else, Jerry Palm, who does tournament bracketology, the Big Ten and the Big 12 often have the same number of teams dancing. And I'm here to tell you right now, without trying to be too disrespectful to the Big Ten, the Big Ten is not the Big 12. Top to bottom, it is not. It is not as top heavy. It is not as dominant throughout the middle. It is not as good even at the bottom. Like, it's not as good of a conference. It is still a good conference. And a lot of these teams still deserve to be in the NCAA tournament. But some of the teams that we're talking about on the bubble, it's like, do they even want to make the big dance? Like, do they even want to end up there? And we start off talking about Michigan because Michigan has actively worked very hard in the last few weeks to destroy their chances of making the NCAA tournament in really, really heartbreaking fashion for their fan base, might I add. They lost double overtime against Illinois last week, and then they lost to Indiana on Sunday in overtime. If they won both those games, they cement themselves in the NCAA tournament. If they win one of those games, they are probably on the right side of the bubble, but they lost both of them. And now they got some significant work that they're going to have to do in the Big Ten tournament. Other games, Northwestern at Rutgers, Northwestern won that one. They now clinched the 2 seed. They are the 2 seed in the Big Ten. Northwestern, Wisconsin, not Michigan, not Michigan State, not anybody else that you can name in the Big Ten behind Purdue. It is the Northwestern Wildcats at the number 2 seed right now. And then Wisconsin at Minnesota. That was the other big game. Wisconsin barely escaped in that one. And they are the 12th seed in the Big Ten tournament. And a team that is still kind of getting bubble conversation despite the situation that they're in right now. Really, really interesting conversation around the Big Ten and the Big 12 and kind of what the Big Ten has done the last few weeks to maybe continue to hurt their chances of having a successful run in the big dance.
All due respect to our Wisconsin brethren out there and folks listening in, but Wisconsin should have just lost at Minnesota and put themselves out of their misery.
Would have made it a little easier.
It would have just made it easier, and then they don't have to have the heartbreak on Sunday. Let's move to Auburn and Tennessee. Auburn, Andy, they've just been this weird roller coaster without any marquee wins all season long, and I've have descended firmly into bubble status, and it was just out of nowhere. But then on Saturday in Auburn, Tennessee comes to town, and the Tigers win 79-70, easily their biggest win of the season. And thankfully for them, it comes at the most important time on the schedule. And for me, as Auburn scores 49 points in the second half, which is probably more than they've scored in like 85 of their games this year, I believe that Auburn has now locked up. No, that's not firm enough. Not I believe. Auburn has now locked up an NCAA tournament spot. They're good. This was the win they needed to just firm it all up. As for Tennessee, I mean, it's still, I'm just going to keep saying the line I've said all season. Don't trust Tennessee. And unfortunately, all the more so now that they are without Zakai Ziegler.
Well, moving over to the ACC, we had a epic rivalry game that unfortunately didn't go particularly well for the Tar Heels. Duke over North Carolina, 62-57, low-scoring affair between these two high-profile programs. And quite honestly, North Carolina needs to make a deep run in the ACC tournament, or else they're not going to be dancing this year. You don't need to bolden that up any more than it already is. That's the reality for Armando Bacot, for Hubert Davis, for the Tar Heels. If they don't win multiple games in the ACC tournament, they might have to go to the championship game. Otherwise, they're not going to find themselves dancing. As for Duke, this team has been on an absolute heater the last couple of weeks, playing some really, really good basketball. Kyle Filipowski had 22 and 13 in this game against the Blue Devils. You're seeing a freshman team, a young team, starting to put things together, starting to kind of peak at the right time. And I wouldn't be surprised to see Duke make a little bit more noise in the NCAA tournament than maybe people are giving them credit for.
These lemon Oreos are now no longer a good luck charm, but a sympathy comfort food.
It's a comfort food.
Yeah. North Carolina scores under 60 points in both regular season games against Duke for the first time since 2009-10, the season when Carolina went to the NIT championship and lost to Dayton. Number 4 in our six-pack, we move back to the SEC. How about Jerry Stackhouse, Andy? Vandy beats Mississippi State 77-72. Mississippi State has been right there as part of the last four in heading to Dayton. It seems like that's where Joe Lunardi still has them even after this loss. But here's the bigger thing. I don't think it cost Mississippi State a bubble spot. But Vanderbilt has now moved into next four out territory. That's not in position to be in the NCAA tournament. But my goodness, the fact that they're even in this conversation after this 77-72 victory over the Bulldogs, well done, Commodores. Nashville is rocking, Andy. What's happening back out on the West Coast?
Well, USC, I think, finally firmed up their spot in the NCAA tournament. They've been kind of sitting on the bubble for a long time, and they've been on the right side of the bubble for a while. And then Arizona State was kind of the other Pac-12 team kind of looming. And as we saw this matchup come together, it was like, well, Arizona State could make some legitimate, serious noise if they're able to pull an upset here, beat USC, maybe move themselves onto the right side of the bubble and push USC the wrong direction. But USC secured the victory. Boogie Ellis, monster game from him. He had 28 points for the Trojans, sent Arizona State packing. This Arizona State team was weird. They were 20-11 in the regular season, which is very, very good, but they were only 11-9 in conference play. They had that big win over Arizona. That really kind of helped firm up their resume in a significant way. But at this point, I'm not saying their chances are dead, but they're going to need to make some noise in the Pac-12 tournament as well. And as for USC, I think, again, they're in a much safer spot where this is probably going to be a team you find maybe not even in that play-in 11 game. They might have done enough work to get themselves an 8 or a 9 seed and just kind of be comfortably into the big dance.
Love it. Speaking of, Andy, it's that wonderful time early in championship week where several of the mid and low major conferences have already wrapped up their conference tournaments. And so we've got 5 to shout out, including an NCAA tournament virgin. We've got the Kennesaw State, the Owls from my home state, a place where I almost went to college to play baseball back in the early 2000s. Way to go, Kennesaw State. Out of the Big South, UNC Asheville. MVC is Drake. NEC Northeastern, Fairleigh Dickinson. And then the OVC Southeast Missouri State. So congrats to all 5 of those schools. We've got 27 more conferences left to go, including 2 that will have their championship games on Monday. So in the SoCon, we get first seeded Furman versus 7th seed Chattanooga, the Mocs at 7 on ESPN, and the Sun Belt Championship game, number 8 South Alabama, and still going on right now, the other semifinal. Let me tell you in real time. Oh, Andy, they've closed the gap. We've got Louisiana, the 2 seed, 56, Texas State, the 11 seed, 50 with 3:55 to go. So listen, I'm looking for the madness. I want Texas State to upset
Yes.
this thing. And then we've got an 8 versus an 11 seed tomorrow, ESPN2 at 7 for the championship there in the Sun Belt. So obviously, as we've said, great time of year, so much going on. We're going to have content for you all week long. Don't you fret. We will be here with you. Speaking of which, if you want to make sure you hear all that, do not forget to subscribe to the show on YouTube and anywhere else you get podcasts. If you're watching, smash the like button. Leave comments on your thoughts on the show. As always, my apologies to the lawyer family, and until we talk to you tomorrow, peace.